very happy to be with you all this evening to discuss something that is of perennial interest: Armenians and Jerusalem. I thought for a while about calling this little series Armenians in Jerusalem, but that makes it a little bit more historical maybe than we are actually going to do in these few weeks. Even though the reason for wanting to do this series is actually historical, as history is presently in the making in Jerusalem. As you probably are aware, Jerusalem's usually quiet Armenian community has been in the news lately, thanks to the vocal and visible efforts of members of the community, including this online presence that has come into existence, to draw attention to and to demand accountability for a shady real estate deal that would deprive the Armenian community, as well as obviously the Patriarchate and the whole Armenian community outside Jerusalem as well, of a substantial piece of property that has been crucial to its history, its character, and its continued existence. Thus, this seems like an opportune moment to spend a few weeks, an hour a week, distilling, boiling down some of the massive literature that there is on the Armenian presence in the Holy Land, and reflecting on how this community came to be, how it's changed over what are now not just many centuries, but we're well into the second millennium of its existence. Although the Armenian presence in Jerusalem was only officially recognized as a patriarchate in 1311, when the Mamluk government of Egypt, which was then overseeing Jerusalem, gave its governmental approval for reasons that we will talk about later in this series. Even though this only occurred in 1311, Jerusalem had been functioning as a patriarchate in everything but name for much, much longer than that. In fact, you could say that for all intents and purposes, Armenian Jerusalem has always been there, at least from the inception of Christianity. And its influence over the centuries has cut across other confessional lines and boundaries that have, from time to time, divided parts of the Armenian world from one another, divided sectors of the Armenian population from one another. And in fact, Jerusalem is home to the longest continuously functioning Armenian community in the world outside of the Armenian homelands. And that alone would make it remarkable. In fact, it's a little hard to let that sink in, really. The fact that Jerusalem is home to the longest continuously functioning Armenian community outside the Armenian homeland. The responsibility, in other words, of Armenian Jerusalem to the rest of the Armenian world is significant. And by the same token, the responsibility of the rest of the Armenian world to Jerusalem is likewise significant. Crucial even to the maintenance of Armenian identity, even in places far distant from Jerusalem physically. Looking at it from a more local perspective, Jerusalem has been and remains the Holy Land's center for Armenians, for the remnants of what were once very robust Armenian communities in Jaffa, Ramle, Bethlehem, Beit Hanina, Ramallah, Nazareth, Haifa, and Akka, not to mention places that used to be within one administrative unit, such as Amman in Jordan and other places. Jerusalem has been a center for Armenians from across the Middle East in a special way, even above and beyond the way that it has been central for Armenians in general, including the Armenian community in Gaza, which has only recently ceased to exist. But Jerusalem's important psychological and spiritual functions and influence in the minds and lives of Armenians over the centuries are only partly reflected in the historical facts. Fascinating though those certainly are, and we're going to look at many of them in the upcoming weeks. It's also important to realize that Jerusalem's spiritual and psychological functions in the minds of Armenians are not merely relics of the past. On the contrary, they're ongoing, very much still alive. As we shall see, Jerusalem has been the Armenians' authority of choice when it comes to settling issues concerning the faith, deciding how liturgical functions should be carried out, and so on. Its role as the epicenter of Armenian religious practice is still unquestioned. I remember in the 1990s, a pair of very zealous, lovely young Armenian men from Karabakh who came to Jerusalem on foot on their way to the monastic centers of Egypt. They were actively searching for a paradigm that they could use in their own monastic experiment. They wanted to found a community. It was then in the planning stages, and Jerusalem was part of their research, so to speak. They planned to begin this monastic community in their home province. It was very inspirational to see them walking around Jerusalem, looking at it with very different eyes than those of us who at that point lived there looked at it. They were looking at it, not just for its past or its present, but for its future potential. What could it bring to their home region in terms of spiritual vitality? Unfortunately, I expect that the devolution of the political situation in Karabakh during the 90s and again recently probably prevented them from ever realizing their vision and building their monastic community there. Nonetheless, they had that vision and they had it bright and clear, and it was strong enough to carry them on foot 2,000 miles to Jerusalem and then beyond. Throughout the 1990s, the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Church in North America sent seminarians to live and study liturgics for a significant amount of time in the monastic setting of the St. James Monastery in Jerusalem. They came for periods from several months to a year, fully immersing themselves in the social and liturgical life of the community. And even today, St. Nerses Armenian Seminary graduates include in their preparation a period of time in the Holy City, as well as in Etchmiadzin and perhaps other centers as well. And recently, I had a student inquire whether it would be possible actually to spend multiple years there in Jerusalem in pursuit of the kind of education that only a living community rooted in a very, very long past can offer. So, Jerusalem's still very much alive and influential. Hence, the importance of contemporary events that affect its present and potentially its future. And one could argue that if roots are what keep the tree of Armenian Christian faith alive, Jerusalem is crucial. Jerusalem is roots. And so we want to know what has kept those roots alive, what has made it possible for them to continue to purvey from the soil of that sacred place nutrients to the superstructure above, to the tree itself. No matter how its leaves may fall and regrow, those roots are what make that process possible. What has created the Armenian presence in Jerusalem as we now know it? And I assume that some of you at least have been there. And even if not, you may well be familiar with the footprint of present-day Armenian Jerusalem. The setting in which the Armenian monastery, the patriarchate, the center of the Jerusalem and Holy Land communities, is situated. And if you look at the map, you can see that one quadrant of the city, the orange one, albeit the smallest, the one on the southwest, the one that actually is located on what was called Mount Zion, still is called Mount Zion, is officially labeled as the Armenian quarter. Many times people ask, why? How in the world did this happen? People who are familiar with Armenia in its present state as a small South Caucasian republic wonder how in the world did it come about that such a small country would control a very significant piece of property in the holy city for the three monotheistic religions. It seems incongruous And people may wonder, what right do the Armenians have to a quarter of the old city of Jerusalem? It's a good question. We who are familiar with it know that the Armenian quarter, which you can see here surrounded by a wall that runs from the center bottom of the screen up and around almost to the center top of the screen. That area is home not only to many people, and you can see the homes. Homes in Jerusalem have like not a lot of privacy because you are looking over your neighbors very closely. It not only contains many homes, and we'll talk later about how it came to contain homes, but it also contains a large area centered on the cathedral of the St. James, since there are two St. Jameses to whom it is dedicated. It contains social buildings. It contains living quarters here in this triangular building for the Brotherhood of St. James. It contains a seminary. It contains a library. It contains a school. It contains a second school that's no longer functioning in that way. How did this concentration come about? Was that wall originally part of the plan or not? You can also see that this quarter of the city is split by a roadway. And that in fact, the patriarchate actually hangs out over the roadway onto the other side. How did that come about? If we are knowledgeable, if we've been to Jerusalem with a really good guide, we may know that in the days when Rome still controlled the city, that road was called the Ruta Armenorum, Armenians' road. And if you've been there with a good guide, you may also know that the area from the present Armenian seminary on the other side of the road to the police barracks now at Jaffa Gate, that area was once an encampment for the Roman military serving in Jerusalem. Whoever they may have been originally, we don't know where all they came from. And you may also have been shown that in that area, mosaic floors came to light, many other things as well. There's a good report of the excavations in this area. And if you look at that mosaic floor, that's not like the beautiful mosaic floors that you see in other wealthy sections of the city. This is a utilitarian floor, something that you would expect to find in a place that's for everyday use, perhaps like a military encampment. So you have to wonder if this and others like it, this floor and others like it, are found in an area that was known to be a Roman encampment on a road that was called the Road of the Armenians. Were some of those Roman soldiers perhaps Armenian? If so, it would put Armenians, obviously not Christian Armenians, pagan Armenians, in Jerusalem at the time of Christ's crucifixion. And you have to wonder also whether perhaps they were participants in that event. So this is interesting, but it is rather speculative. So exactly when Armenian roots began to find their way into the soil of Jerusalem depends a little bit on how we look at it. It's possible to say the roots go back to here. The roots go back prior to the foundation of Christianity, prior to the foundation of the church. And if we are looking for the presence of people from Armenia in Jerusalem in earliest Christian times, and we want something a little bit more solid than this, we can go back as far as Pentecost. The 2nd century church father from North Africa, Tertullian, was very disturbed by the absence of Armenians from the list of nations whose representatives were present to hear the apostles speak in their own languages at that first Pentecost. Tertullian read his text carefully, and to him, it seemed so natural that Armenians would have been there, presumably Jews from Armenia, that he rewrote the list to include them. In his treatise called A Response to the Jews, he gave the list in this way. So at the top, he's introducing it, and then, in whom have the nations believed? And he repeats the list from Acts 2, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and they who inhabit Mesopotamia, Armenia, the original list says Judea, Mesopotamia, Armenia, Phrygia, Cappadocia, and they who dwell in Pontus and Asia and Pamphylia, dwellers in Egypt, and inhabitants of the region of Africa, which is beyond Cyrene. Romans and sojourners, yes, and in Jerusalem, Jews, and all other nations. It kind of covers the bases there at the end. But he replaced Judea with Armenia for 2 reasons that he explains. First of all, it would fit better geographically in the list because Parthians, Medes, Elamites, Mesopotamia, Armenia is right there. Judea is nowhere in the location. Phrygia, Cappadocia, you're still continuing around to the west. It would be the same arc of locations. The second reason why he felt free to make this change was that it would make no sense for people from Judea to be surprised when they heard fellow Jews speaking in their language. It was the same language. Hence, he had extra confirmation that that spot belonged to Armenia. Thus, it becomes likely that Armenians would have been among the first to convert to the faith that the apostles were preaching. On that day, the account in Acts says, there were added to the church some 3,000 souls. So Christian Armenians, first minted in Jerusalem, long before the advent of the first illuminators of Armenia, the apostles, in the region of Armenia itself. Not surprisingly, our information about Armenians in Jerusalem and the Holy Land picks up significantly once Christianity becomes a legal religion. But before that, there is one more Jerusalem-Armenia connection that's mentioned. So here you have the event at Pentecost, and at the bottom, you have an Armenian who has taken off his velar, you can see it dropped below the frame, in order to participate, spiritually at least, in that event. According to the Ecclesiastical History of Eusebius, one of the earliest texts, a certain Alexander, bishop of Gamirk, we'll talk about where Gamirk is in just a second, had a dream. And in his dream, he was told to go to Jerusalem to help the aged bishop there, who was beset with difficulties and problems. And so Alexander set out. And as he was arriving in Jerusalem, Eusebius tells us, the bishops there in the city also saw dreams in which they were instructed to receive Alexander and not to let him return to the north. And they didn't. They did exactly what the dream said. And so Alexander served as Jerusalem's bishop for 35 years. At first, jointly with Narcissus, who was the elderly bishop of Jerusalem, and then alone after Narcissus had left office and passed away. And Eusebius tells us that he used Alexander's library to compile the information for his famous history of the church. So what's the Armenian connection here? The Armenian connection is that Gamirk is also known as Cappadocia. And Cappadocia was a section of eastern Anatolia that went in and out of Armenian control and that was home to a mixed population of Armenians and Greeks. When the Armenian church was officially founded in the 4th century, St. Gregory the Illuminator, who was the first head of the church, and his successors were for several generations consecrated in Caesarea, which was the capital city of Cappadocia, Gamirk. So whether Alexander himself was ethnically an Armenian, we don't know, and in those days it didn't really matter. But he came from having governed an area with a very heavy Armenian presence. It's interesting. The earliest evidence that we have for Armenian roots in Jerusalem in the form of a settled community comes from the time when Christianity first became a legal religion. As you may already know, in 324, Constantine defeated his rival Licinius, became the sole head of the Roman Empire, and in 325, 1 year later, he convened the Council of Nicaea, which we are celebrating the anniversary of this year. He convened the council in order to try to bring some order into a church which had been divided very much over the times of its persecution, and all kinds of different ideas had arisen in different localities. And the church was divided especially over the ideas of a man named Arius. So present at this council was a man named Macarius, who was the bishop of Jerusalem at the time. And Macarius came to the council not just because one should, but because he wanted to engage the emperor in his own agenda for Jerusalem. Macarius had a vision of Jerusalem as a center of Christian pilgrimage, a center of Christian worship. And he was particularly focused on having the emperor recover the tomb of Christ, which tradition in Jerusalem had long maintained lay beneath the temple of the goddess Aphrodite, which the Emperor Hadrian had caused to be erected above it, not intentionally, it was just a good building site, in the year 134. So people in the 4th century are still remembering, passed down generation to generation, the piece of information that the tomb of Christ was preserved beneath that pagan structure. And he was successful. Just as a little aside, Bishop Macarius's tomb is located in a small chapel in the north wall of the Cathedral of St. James. You can see it on the very left. So as I said, Eusebius tells us that Macarius was in getting the emperor on board with his plan. According to Eusebius's Life of Constantine, not his history this time, but his biographical work about the emperor, Constantine ordered that when they were completed, he didn't interfere very much in the actual structure, but when they were completed, there should be a building housing the tomb and an accompanying basilica, and those should be the most beautiful buildings in his entire empire. Here's a sketch of his intention. No expense was to be spared. The ceiling of the basilica would be covered in gold. The walls would be marble. The pillars would have ornate decorations. And the 12 pillars of the apse, which you can see if you progress from the right of the screen, you're in the Basilica Church. In between the basilica and the tomb, which is a rotunda at the other side, is an open space containing the rock of Calvary, the rock of Golgotha. Just to the right a little bit of the rock, you can see the apse of the basilica. And as his personal donation, the emperor provided 12 giant silver urns to sit atop each pillar, commemorating the 12 apostles. Now that, in and of itself, was lovely, great investment, but it was only the beginning of the construction of a completely Christian Jerusalem. Now no longer just a tolerated religion, but the favored religion of the imperial regime, Christianity set out to commemorate the major sites of Christ's life in a systematic way. Now, Constantine and his mother Helena, who's shown here doing two things. On the left, she's seated on a throne with attendants around her, and on the right, she's inspecting the newly unearthed cross of Christ. This is an illumination from a 9th century copy of the homilies of St. Gregory of Nazianzus. She and her son ordered the construction not only of the Holy Sepulchre Church site commemorating Christ's death and resurrection, but also of the Nativity Church in Bethlehem, the Church at the Upper Room, the Church of the Ascension. It was a massive building program designed to allow people to come and venerate, experience the sites most important to the life of Christ in person. And there was room in this building program for others who were clients of the empire to take part, to patronize their own constructions. And so as a Christian head of state and a client of the empire, Armenia's King Turdat participated. Here you see him in an illumination from an 11th century Psalter, copied in the famous monastery of Studios in Constantinople, by a monk, interestingly, from Caesarea in Cappadocia, showing Gregory leading Turdat, holding him by the hand, to Christ. So Turdat can be expected to have participated with enthusiasm in the building of pilgrimage sites and accommodations for pilgrims who would begin to arrive in the Holy Land almost immediately. And tradition says that King Turdat took part not only in the construction of buildings around the Holy Sepulchre Church, but also in financing the church in Bethlehem, and tradition says that the Church of the Holy Archangels, which is now buried deep inside the monastery complex of St. James, was one of his foundations as well, a foundation that would be later much expanded. So we don't know how large a community may have been established to care for these new institutions, to care for the pilgrimage groups that would come to them. We'll come back to the matter of pilgrims probably next week. But we do know that Armenians became a significant presence in the city. At the end of the 4th century, a man named Saint Jerome, a translator of the Bible into Latin, arrived in the Holy Land with 2 of his most notable students, both women, a noble woman named Paula and her daughter Eustochium. Here you can see them in a mosaic that has been placed inside the cave where they may have resided, part of a complex of caves that are now in the undercroft of the Roman Catholic Church in Bethlehem, contiguous to the Church of the Nativity. And while they were there, they also set up a school whose remains are traditionally identified here beneath the Armenian monastery, just a few feet from the cave where they would have lived. The Armenian monastery forms the north-south wing of the Bethlehem Nativity Church complex, as you can see here. So Jerome and his disciples would have been living to the left of the screen. The school would have been to the right. And from this place, the 3 of them wrote letters back to friends in the empire, encouraging them to also make the pilgrimage to the Holy Land, maybe not to stay, but at least to come to see the places. And in a letter to somebody named Marcella, Paula and her daughter, or perhaps Jerome writing on their behalf, enumerated the peoples, the nations, the ethnicities, the groups that could be found in charge of the holy places in Jerusalem, and among them are named the Armenians. So in that time already, Armenians are recognized for their responsibility for the holy sites of the life of Christ in Jerusalem. And Jerome and Paula's monastery and pilgrim hospice was not the only one in the city. It competed with a more elite institution on the Mount of Olives that was run by a friend of Jerome's, a former friend, named Rufinus, and his companion in things spiritual, a woman, formidable woman, named Melania, a relative of the emperor who had come to live in Jerusalem for good, and she would die there in the early part of the 5th century. And Melania and Rufus built an institution, 2 of them actually, on the Mount of Olives to cater to the needs of upper-class pilgrims, noble pilgrims, especially those who might be connected to the imperial court. And part of this set of institutions was discovered in the late 19th century in what is now the Russian convent of the Ascension on the Mount of Olives. Inside the buildings of this convent were discovered a number of mosaics, rather plain workmanship, not like super excellent quality, nice, but nothing particularly special, with Armenian inscriptions. And these mosaics were clustered around the spot where, according to tradition, John the Baptist was beheaded. Other traditions put his beheading somewhere else. Interesting letters. It doesn't look like the mosaicist was very accustomed to creating these letters. They're rather rough, somewhat like the mosaic itself, not the highest quality. And people wondered, okay, maybe these are 6th century, something like that. But then not far away from these mosaics, this one is interesting. The hole in the floor is supposed to be where John's head fell when he was beheaded. You can see it's been patched up. It's at the edge of this kind of mosaic carpet. Not far away, in a separate building, was a marvelous mosaic, highest quality workmanship, with medallions containing fruit, birds, fish. What made it a Christian mosaic, clearly, was the lamb in the center medallion. You can kind of see it there. I don't have very good photos of it. It's impossible to get one, as far as I'm concerned, from straight above. There are other things in the way. And this mosaic floor was dated to the 4th century, maybe the early 5th. But then there was a puzzle about it, because as you can see, kind of along the top edge of it is an inscription, and the inscription is in Armenian. And when people looked at it carefully, they were like, huh, the cubes of that inscription are oriented differently from the cubes in the rest of the mosaic. So it looks as though there had been another inscription which was removed, and this one was added. So once Armenian letters became available, in other words. And what it says is, this is the resting place of the blessed Shushanik, the mother of Ardavan. So whoever Ardavan was, she wanted to be identified as his mother. And we're not sure who he is. And people were a little puzzled too. This mosaic looks like it belongs in a chapel, some kind of a worship space, and yet the mosaic inscription makes it a funerary inscription. It should be at a tomb. And some years later, the question of how this could be, what a funerary inscription is doing in what with a mosaic that looks like it was made for a worship space. Question was answered when underneath that floor, there was discovered an underground chamber. And in that underground chamber were found the tombs of several individuals. You can see ossuary boxes in the back, but there are also actual in-ground tombs. And among them are 3 with names. And if you look at the right angle for the one on the left, it says Jojik in Armenian.
Is it Joe or a hub?
It's a Jo. So there's 2 Jos. There's another one that says Mari and a third one that says Shushan. They were destroyed sometime in the 1990s, if I'm remembering correctly, by a rather overzealous Russian monk who was in charge of the site at the time. He simply took a pickaxe to them. And that wasn't the only Armenian remains on the Mount of Olives, showing that the Armenians are present in a very large and quite aristocratic complex. But a short distance from the Shushan mosaic, there were also, in the late 1800s, remains of 2 more, both of them with Armenian inscriptions. One said, having as an intercessor with God the holy prophet Isaiah and these blessed fathers, so one thinks it's probably within the men's side of this complex, I Varan, or Yes Varan, perhaps, as a full name, made this inscription for the forgiveness of my sins. The other one said, for the prayers and salvation of Teva, Abbas, and Maurik. Not Armenian names, but it seems that they belonged to Armenians. The inscription was in Armenian. These also have since disappeared. We know about them from descriptions, but they are no longer there. So there was at least one institution of Armenians on the Mount of Olives. Armenians who were sufficiently highly placed within the community to be commissioning mosaic floors and to be buried in special locations. And in fact, the life of a man known as Peter the Iberian mentions that Melania, together with her parents, founded 2 convents, one for men and one for women, on Olives, which would fit together with the content of those mosaic inscriptions. And these establishments had as their general superior a clergyman named Gerontius, which is not obviously an Armenian name. However, he was in possession of relics from the 40 martyrs of Sevastia, who were particularly revered by the Armenian church. So whether he was Armenian or himself or not, we don't know. But those relics would have meant something extra special in a community that had Armenian members. So we have Armenians in the city, Armenians on the Mount of Olives. A similar mosaic floor of very good quality was also discovered in a neighborhood just north of the Damascus Gate. For many years, it was hidden beneath the headquarters of a Jerusalem newspaper publisher. And in order to get to see it, one needed to know the guy who had the key to the door that was behind the old refrigerators and other useless junk that you would never get to see unless you knew it was there. And you see a picture of the mosaic here. This is also a funerary mosaic, also one with an inscription that was removed, presumably it was a Greek inscription, and then an Armenian inscription added to it later.
Is this Armenian or Greek?
Armenian. But it doesn't really matter, Armenian or Greek. We're pre-Chalcedon, it doesn't matter. And the inscription reads, "For the sake of the memory and the salvation of all those whose names the Lord knows."
Can you read the Armenian?
Vasen Hishadagi Yefurkutyan Amenain Hayot Zorot Zanvanes Deirkide.
So that's some honest.
So you can see that things have been put over the top of this mosaic. So obviously it goes on underneath that structure that's kind of curved around the emblem at the top of it.
Interesting.
And this mosaic was also above a burial cave, and you used to be able to, if you were small and spry, get down into that cave through a hole in the floor at the side of the mosaic. I never personally liked being in enclosed spaces, nor was I ever that small, but a very thin young person actually did go down there to have a look. Recently, this mosaic was taken up from its location here, where it was not very visible and where it was endangered if anything happened to that building, or if the building was sold, and it was moved to the Patriarchate, where you can now see it. So we have Armenians in the convent, the area that now is the Armenian Patriarchate. We have Armenians on the Mount of Olives. We have Armenians outside the Damascus Gate. And although I don't have a photo of it, I thought I did. Not too far, in fact, just a few feet from this mosaic for the memory and salvation of all those Armenians whose names the Lord knows. Not far from this, when the Israelis dug up a segment of road in order to build a new, wider, I think it was Route 1 at that point, they discovered the remains of an entire monastic complex, in which, once again, there was an Armenian mosaic. And since I forgot it this time, I'll bring it next time. It's a very lovely little mosaic inscription by a priest named Eustathius, who put it in what appears to be the narthex of a chapel. So just before you go in the door, and it's round like a little carpet. And he asks those stepping across it into the sanctuary to pray for him and his brother Lucas. And lo and behold, a few feet from the mosaic was discovered a tombstone with the name Lucas. So Armenians in Jerusalem, little communities or service groups of Armenians at various points in the city and in Bethlehem, started the process of creating what we know today as Armenian Jerusalem. So what we're going to do next time is to have a look at one of the other major components of the Armenian presence in Jerusalem, the presence of pilgrims coming to venerate the holy sites, but many of them also deciding to stay. Where did they come from? Where did they stay? How were they cared for? What did they see? That too was and is actually today the same thing, a major component of the Armenian presence in Jerusalem. And so it's very important now, as it was then, that there are Armenian groups going from Istanbul almost every year, from the Eastern Diocese whenever possible, from Armenia. There are wonderful films, perhaps you've seen them online, following pilgrims from Armenia to Jerusalem. How does all this come together? How does it gel? How does it become the center we know today, a walled presence within the city?